Hi, good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for tuning in to Identity, this podcast. I appreciate that. Today, this very day, I'm going to talk to you as best I can, as best through my ability to say it. I'm going to talk to you about inversion, and let me sit here and try to work up my enthusiasm for the topic. I've been thinking about this topic a lot over the last couple of weeks because it's a topic that's kind of uncovered that people don't give a lot of credit to because it's a difficult thing to understand, and it's kind of like the world hasn't gotten so far as to try to understand it, especially at the point that you're thinking of inversion as opposed to just an inverse of like inverses people talk about, or that a plane, when it screws up, it might be flying inverted. The plane is flying inverted and then it crashes because there's some high profile plane crashes that happen that way. Like inverse comes up, it's just inversion. But let me first describe, I want to clarify a couple points that I've made about during the course of the podcast, because I want to be right about the things that I say. And maybe it's not so much that, like, it's not like I don't have to be right. It's just that I have to be correct. Maybe I think that's it. But no, it doesn't really matter. But I am trying to do this podcast in the name of presenting you a unified theory by the end of it. And so it would help to iron out some of the contradiction or things that sound like contradictions, which aren't contradictions, but I'll explain to you. Because pretty much I have an episode titled Infinity Equals One, and then, so I'm saying infinity is equal to one. And then in the time space episode, I deliberately made the point that time is equal to one. And so if you follow that pattern, you might be like, oh, is everything just equal to one? Well, yeah, actually everything is equal to one in a 100% sense. So yeah. Yeah, you're right. So good job following that pattern. Everything is equal to one. In comparison to nothing, nothing is equal to zero. Everything is equal to one in terms of percent. But what I wanted to say is that time being equal to one is a more traditional sense of an equation, because I'm just saying every instance of time is equal to one. Me saying that infinity is equal to one is a less traditional use of one, but less traditional use of an equation. But it has to do with equality, that I would say both of those things are true, is because equality really needs to be specified further. It needs to be categorized further, differentiated further. Like we have kind of a limited view of equality as it stands, that we don't categorize different forms of equality. Equality is equal signs. There's like a blanket description for what's happening that we use equals for every kind of problem, like 3 times 4, like every multiplication problem, or 3 squared equals 9. We use equals signs for everything. I think in all of those cases, like, those are all the traditional uses of an equal sign, so those are all fine. It's just that like equality, you have to try to understand the capacity of a term like equality. How far can it go? What can you make an equal sign for? Like, is a particle equal to a wave? Because that's the sense in which I'm saying infinity is equal to one, is the same thing as wave is equal to particle. And so if you agree with me that a wave is equal to a particle, then you agree with me that infinity is equal to one, because I'm saying that's the exact same idea. It's just translated into a different language, the language of numbers. And it would be the same thing to say that space is equal to time, where I'm saying that time is equal to one. But the way that I'm saying time is equal to one is like more of a substitutional thing, where it's like you could substitute time for one in every instance, because any time that you're discussing is a recognition or an observance, is the argument that I'm making. A time is always an observation, which which makes you recognize the limits of a definition like time, more so than you think you would be able to, because we use time to describe like the space between a minute, the space between the beginning point of a minute and then the ending point, when the 60 seconds is completed. So there's like, you need 2 points to carve out that minute. And so we typically use time to describe the space between those points, yet it is only times, or like manifestations of times or events, that fall under the definition of time. And so it's really only observances that are times, even though the space between a minute consists of infinite conceivable times. Like you could mark out 30 seconds of the way through and say, and recognize that event. And that would be the same thing as recognizing the event at a minute. And so you could conceivably recognize infinite events within that space. But because you can go down to the nanosecond, within a minute, and even further than a nanosecond into units that we've never even recognized, that are more microscopic than a nanosecond. So you could recognize infinite events within a minute, but anything that's a time is like, oh, that's a time, it's an observation, because 1 minute, 2 minute, the markers that you put at each minute or each hour are the times. It's just you're trying to describe beyond that, the space, because time is mysterious with what it's actually trying to describe. It's just like I'm pointing out that there's limits to the definition time, because it only accounts for every manifestation of an observation, really, in reality. But it's like, but you recognize that observations themselves are times, like the chair in your house, that's a time based on its lifespan, but based on its ability to frequent itself in the world relative to other objects, because all objects have different definitions. But I'm saying every observation is a one, because it's ultimately a definition. Now, a one is really abstract, it's not specified, because then it'd be the same thing as saying a definition. Look at definition itself, and that's not specified at all. It's only at the point that you recognize a specific definition, like an armchair, that you give it a name. It's just that so you can give particular names to different times, to different ones, but at its most basic level, a time is equal to a one, to the point that like every time is, because of the limits of the definition of time. Now, you would want to, so I'm saying that because of equality, there are many different forms of equation, and we see that just by the fact that we use an equal sign for subtraction, division, addition. But a form of equation that we don't categorize well enough would be like, is a particle equal to a wave? Because it's not like science would necessarily go that far as to say that that's true, but we do look at the idea behind that like that particle is also a wave, just in different forms, like converted into different forms. But like pretty much equality or equals is maybe the best term, or it is one of the best terms. It's probably the best term that we have to describe the relationship between particle and wave in this entity that exists as a duality of both of them. And that's what I'm describing with infinity one. It's like a duality of inverses, but pretty much the thing that I'm describing with one infinity, and particle wave and time space, and be the same thing as like finite infinite, is that those things are inverses of each other, but they're kind of like inverses of each other because there's something like opposites. And so you'll want to understand what is equal about opposites, even though their opposites are not equal to each other, but like pretty and ugly describe the same idea. They're just two extreme, a negative and a positive extreme emotions describing the same idea. So it describes something like appearance, in both cases. But if you understand how appearance links those two, then you can put pretty and ugly on opposite ends of a spectrum and then see how they're inverses of each other that relate to each other as you move across the spectrum, because from pretty to ugly, it gets uglier every step of the way across the spectrum. And then from ugly to pretty, it gets prettier every step of the way across the spectrum. It works the same way with wavelength and frequency in the visible spectrum, and where those are both inverses of each other. But the entirety of the spectrum kind of accounts for in inversion, the process of inversion. The process of inversion happens pretty to ugly while happening ugly to pretty across the spectrum, that if you created that spectrum to account for those two extremes. But it's like they're opposites of each other, but through inversion there's a certain equality that happens. And more specifically, the equality happens at the very middle of the spectrum, where neither pretty nor ugly has authority over the other one, because it's kind of like a process of giving up authority from left to right or right to left, either in the visible spectrum for frequency and wavelength, or this hypothetical pretty ugly spectrum. Like it's a process of giving up authority, because on one extreme end of the visible spectrum, frequency has the most authority. Like it's the part of the spectrum where frequency is at its highest, and then at the far left end, to the red end of the spectrum, wavelength is at its highest. And so, but at the middle of the spectrum is a duality of even authority, so to speak. And there's like an equality that happens in inversion, but it's like from pretty to ugly is the inversion process. Yet, well, it's only half the story, because from pretty to ugly and then ugly to pretty, those are two halves of a duality of the inversion process. But it's kind of like inversion is a interesting term, since it's accounting for two directions at the same time. And so it's like, where does the inversion happen? At the middle, where they both have equal authority. But it's kind of like inversion is it has to do with inverses. But if you consider the term conspiracy as it's brought up in political terms, like it's an important political idea, and it's like it's something that we're using to describe conspiratorial forces that work against you. But the point that I'm making is conspiracy. Now ignore spectrums, ignore that example, at least for the time being, because that can get too spectrum centric, like where I'm just because it's difficult to talk about the inner workings of a spectrum, especially like probably doesn't make for great radio. So there's better ways to do that. But like think of the term conspiracy, and you'll understand that inversion works in just the term, because the term is inversive. So there's certain ideas that have inversive properties, like conspiracy does, because the second that you're talking about conspiracy, you don't know if it's, especially in the American political climate, you don't know if it is for you or if it's against you. Like, and that's what makes it inversive, because it's both subjective and objective. Like, you have to, if you're trying to talk about conspiracy theorists, you're worried about who's conspiring against you without any proof of that there's actually a conspiracy. And like and so in order to describe conspiracy correctly, it's almost like you have to be part of the conspiracy in order to have proof of it. Like, and so you have to be conspiring, but it's only against another group that you would be conspiring against, like a group outside of yourselves. And so conspiracy brings to light the dynamic between your tribe and the outer tribe that you're against, or like, so conservative versus liberal. And like the conservative versus liberal dynamic is an inversive one on its own, but really inversion describes any duality like that. Like liberal conservative is an inversive thing, because liberal is like the inverse of conservative. Conservative is like the inverse of liberal, because they kind of do the inside out of each other, and that's why they're always at odds. But inversion is kind of like an inside out. If you're going to describe other characteristics of inversion. So let me just talk about the idea itself. It's kind of like mirror-like behavior. And so liberals often mirror what people on the right do by throwing back at them, like whatever the right accuses the left of, the left then throws that right back at the right. And it happens vice versa. They both throw back the thing that they're being accused of. And so the right is now starting to accuse the left of conspiracy. But it was the left that first accused the right of fake news. The right responded by saying, you're fake news. So that fake news became relative to both sides. And then we're like, that's the point at which you kind of evolve past the topic as a society. And so it's a process of evolution that we have both the liberal side and the conservative side. We need both of them, because they're inverses of each other, and so they complete a whole circle. They're like two halves of a whole, and one of them is negative, one of them is positive, and depending on your perspective, you might say liberal is positive, or you might say liberal is negative. It's just, and that's another thing that's inversive about it. It's like if you're on the right, you think you're positive and they're negative. If you're on the left, you think that you're positive and the right is negative. And so it's like it's an inversion of positivity and negativity. And really, positivity and negativity themselves is very inversive. But like it's only inversive when it's two opposing variables. I bet you could describe inversion as two things that aren't opposed, but in its purest sense, like inversion is more about two opposing variables. And I think it's interesting. You think about time and space. We often don't think about them as opposites, but they're like a special kind of opposite that you eventually get to a place where you can't describe one without the other. They're so like the liberals, whatever they say, the right tries to throw it back at them. Like the right has been calling the left propaganda for a long time, but now the left is starting to say everything that the right does is propaganda, or at least certain segments of the left do that when they recognize that that's a label that is being thrust upon the left, that the left, it lessens the ability of the left it limits the left, because if you come up with an accurate definition descriptor for your opponent, it limits their ability to speak. It limits their freedom until they're able to recognize the limits of the definition, and so the left does that to the right does that to the left, and they come up with accurate terms for it. The left and one of the most effective terms that's been created in the last 15 years is conspiracy, and especially from the left to describe the right. And it's like almost something that the right can't even ever get out from under, because no matter what they try to do, they're always labeled as conspiracy. And really the way that you defeat that in a lot of cases is you just have to be successful at spreading the idea that the left is also just as much about conspiracy, which they are, because they're just as paranoid about the right as the right is about the left. And they are, and besides that, conspiring in a lot of ways to make sure that they survive over the right. But since you have something like in America, two major parties, like obviously these are the two biggest parties, they inevitably become inverses of each other, because everything that the left does is like in contrast to the right. Everything that the right does is in contrast to the left, so that everything that either party does is already checked by everybody on the other side. So it's like you do something, yet not only are you positing something like the right has certain attributes that characterize it, like they don't like abortion, but the second they're like, we posit our position in the world is we don't like abortion, then it is actually immediately a position on the left. And that's what inversion is like. But it carries out most strongly in cases like this bicameral, like two house. It carries out most strongly where there's two major political parties, but that fulfills the entire political landscape is just two parties. So it's like it's already a duality. It carries out most strongly where it's just two things that are inverses of each other, where they're opposing, but two things that exist within the same entity, like liberal conservative, they exist within the same entity of America, and so are forced to collide with each other constantly. And so since they're already opposites, a position in either side is automatically a position on the other side. But more specifically, if you're on the left and your position is to raise the minimum wage, then, and the right is against that, their position is no, you keep the minimum wage where it is, because raising the minimum wage always raises unemployment. So the second that your position on the left is raise the minimum wage, it's actually so it's a position on the right, but it's actually a negation in terms of the way that the left is seeing it. From the perspective of the left, the negation of that position is automatically represented on the right, but it's kind of like a position, because on the right, if it's from the perspective of the right, then it's a position, but it's a position negation or positivity negativity relationship, and either one could be positive or negative, the same way that in a spectrum, frequency and wavelength, you can consider any point within the visible spectrum to be either in terms of frequency or in terms of wavelength. And so that's like it's like an inversion that plays out. So inverses, but you already recognize that inverses happen. You already recognize that inverses happen mathematically because 7 is the inverse of 1/7, and then conversely, 1/7 is the inverse of 7, but both of those happen at the same time, where it's like you can't escape that 1/7 is the inverse of 7 while 7 is the inverse of 1/7. They're both interchangeable in that regard, but they're interchangeable. And so like you see how inversion is so important with the relationship between the numerator versus the denominator, because in order for the inverse to be created of 7, you just place the 7 in the denominator. So it's a relationship between the numerator and the denominator, or in other words, the namer and the denamer. What's important is if you put them together, and that's what's important. That's what's important about it, is if you put 7 and 1/7 together, like so that you have 7 over 7, then that is basically describing the inversion of that's the complete inversion of the relationship, is a 7 over 7. And do that for every number. Understand that the inversion between 5 and then its inverse 1/5 is like 5 over 5. The inversion is the term for the whole the completion of the whole thing. Let me talk about something else for just a minute. This is an intermission. What else could I talk about? Well, it's like insults and complements are inversive. You could kind of consider any pair of opposites to be inversive as long as you set them on two extremes of a spectrum, but you have certain words that are automatically inversive, like passive-aggressive describes two extremes. Those are two opposites, but we've merged them into one word. So it's kind of like a space-time type word, passive-aggressive. And they're inverses of each other if you considered every instance of passive aggression, where at one end, well, like the more you get to just aggressive, the more that there's no passive, and so it's just more an action if you consider the spectrum from passion to aggression. Is it passion? Passiveness? Passion? That can't be right. Passivity to aggression. At the aggressive end, it's closer to an action. But like sadomasochism, same thing. Or just dominant. Sadomasochism, just dominant versus submissive. Dominant submissive is really inversive. But like if you were an inversive person, then you have the ability to be both of those more so, because the real inversion is happening like it gets really inversive the more you get towards the middle of the spectrum. And like that's what's interesting about inversion, is kind of highlights the borderline, where it's like with conspiracy, it highlights the border line between your group and another group, like the dividing line between you, because there's conspiracy happening on your end, but yet there's also conspiracy happening on their end because they are being conspired against, but they have to label the conspiracy before the conspiracy gets them. And so they're like, you're on the outside looking at conspiracy if you're labeling it, yet conspiracy happens only for you if you're taking part in it. But it's what it highlights is the division line between you and another group. And if there's only two groups, like it is in liberal conservative, the important division line is the line that happens exactly halfway between liberals and conservative, or like halfway between American political landscape, which is like hypothetical. There's no geographic location or anything like that for a line that divides America in half equally, but like the very middle of a spectrum is a dividing line at the that divides the two sides into halves equally. So like the inversion is happening most at the border, at the point of division that you're recognizing. It's like that's where the inversion, that's where it's really happening. And so if you're like dominant and submissive at the same time, that is you, because that's where dominance and submission are giving authority over to each other. And so that's a good example because they're both like, it's describing an authoritative relationship, dominance versus submission. And it's like, and it's the same as numerator versus denominator, or namer versus denamer. The namer is dominant over the denamer naturally, and that's why we orient it that way specifically. There's no such thing as a fraction that has the numerator in the bottom, you know? There's no numerator ever in the bottom of a fraction. And it's because dominance is always over submission, but that's because the namer is more closer to a creator, but the denamer is closer to a creation or a derivative. The namer is, but like because the denominator is less than has to be submissive to the namer, but where that becomes significant is if you have the same number in both the numerator and the denominator. Like if you have a 5 over 5, then you're seeing how a 5 presents itself in different contexts or in different languages. And really it's the case that mathematics, when somebody makes a proof, like somebody proves that the summation of x squared is equal to whatever, like you can rearrange x squared to be in front of a summation in some cases. It's just like the rearrangement of things from instance to instance in a proof, but like how they're all connected by equal signs. Either side of an equal sign, those are just transformations of the same idea into different languages in pretty much every case, because 3 times 2 equals 6. That's it's 6 on both sides. 3 times 2 is already 6, where it says 3 times 2, it's just 6 written in a different way. But that you're saying that 6 is equal to 6 is really pointless when you think about it, but that's only possible because there are different languages for 6. Like different transformations in proofs across equal signs in math, those are the same thing always, but written in different languages. The only reason you're putting a different side as equal to one side is because you're writing the same thing in a different language, because it's the same element, the same idea. But it's like for numerator denominator, if you have a 5 over 5, that is a 5 in different languages, but in actually more specifically through the numerator denominator description is a 5 in different stages of dominance, but it's like kind of like above or below, like, or a vertical existence of 5. But it's like that's how you describe 5 as being in 2 different transformations or 2 different languages, or at least one of the ways, because it's automatically true that it's a 5 in different stages of development or maturity, because it's a 5 in different contexts, because it's a 5 with different names. In one context, the 5 has the name namer or numerator, and then the other context, 5 has the name denominator. But it's you understand that both of those are different things, yet so like 5 isn't just 5 the value, it is many different. It's like 5 is translated like 5 across time, or 5 in every conceivable context is the 5 you want to consider. And so like there's a definition that you need to give for when 5 over 5, when you have that, because it's describing a 5 in that is inversive. Really it's just inversion, because it's dominant and submissive at the same time, but like archetypally, because in that case numerator and denominator offset each other in a completely inverse way, like to the point that like that's the same thing as a liberal conservative, because there are only 2 categories fulfill the whole picture and are the whole picture. Like it's 2 categories or a duality within one entity, or like a covariance, the same way liberal conservative exists within the entity America. Because like if you're just looking at the numerator denominator picture, that is 2 categories that fulfill a whole entity, especially when you consider that every number 5x, the inverse of x is 1 over x, but the inverse of 1 over x is x. But that's just like a picture of inversion across exactly 2 co-variables, and they're different variables because they have different names. And like, so it's just inversion. Before I started talking about that, so I'm gonna when I get to the end of this, let me describe where I'm going with this, especially like the Earth, because you can look at numbers and see automatically how we write them as inverses of each other. But if you look at something like the Earth, what is the inverse of the Earth? But so if you had Earth, and then you to write the inverse of the earth mathematically, if you substituted it into math, it would be 1 over the earth. And so at the end I'll try to describe what that looks like in practically, like what is a description for 1 over earth. But it's like, because we don't approach inversion, we're not trying to answer questions like that, or like describe practically what 1 over the earth might look like. But I was going to talk about how insults and compliments are the same thing, but you might be on one, like you fall on different points within the spectrum of insult to compliment and how you view them. Because if a compliment is thrown your way from a party outside of yourself, so there's a division that exists between you and other people, your group and another group, whether it be you individually or your tribe individually and another tribe, or just you individually and another person individually. There's a division that exists between you and them, and like the line for that division is kind of the point at which subjectivity becomes objectivity from your perspective to theirs, or as you're receiving their words, it's like the point at which objective becomes subjective as they go into your mind and imagination. Like the way that you perceive things through your mind, I would say that that's subjective. But there's a border, there's a barrier that exists between your party and other people's parties. And like if you receive a compliment from somebody else, you might say that that is an insult. Like to me, I pretty much never hear I never hear a compliment that I like. Like I don't ever no, I don't like compliments, because that's just the way that I view them. I view them as insults. So everything, whether it be insult or compliment that I hear is closer to an insult for me. But that's just because on the spectrum from insult to compliment, I fall closer to the insult authority side, where I say everything is an insult, because it's like every compliment is an insult if you want to look at it that way, because it's kind of like a dig at you. Like it's just that compliment is where insults become positive, and that happens at the middle of this spectrum. So it's like a positive to negative thing is what happens at the very middle of this spectrum, where one variable gives authority to another one. Where it's like, yeah, with like pretty is the positive extreme and ugly is the negative extreme. But it's like insult and compliment. I would say compliment, because compliments are just people trying to describe you or define you, sort of. They're like, they give you a compliment. Like if somebody tells me that, my mind is deep or something, like it's not really, I don't care for that. Or it's like, it's just kind of, it's like, you could look at it as a way for somebody else is trying to define me. Not that they mean it, they mean it negative intentionally. It's just like, I'm not going to accept a compliment and let it define me, because that's what compliments are, definers, the same way that insults are, is the point that I'm making. I'm not going to let it define me, because that can limit you. Ultimately, they're all limiters. It's just that you might be on the other end, where you're like, you take insults as compliments or something like that. So maybe you're just a lot less sensitive or something if everything is a compliment to you. I don't know, but it's like I'd say I'm more of a sensitive person, and so I view everything as an insult. But I do that because to not accept it, I do that so I don't accept a description about myself. So you might fall somewhere on the either end of the spectrum. So it's like, if you can't accept a compliment, that's because you're too insecure. But why would you want to be secure? Actually, why would you want to be secure? You want your circumstances to be what they already are, to be foundational, like to not vary. You want your circumstances to define you. Why would I want to be secure? I want things to change. I like chaos. I like chaos a little bit more. So I don't like your compliments. So it's something like that. So you fall somewhere, but you see how compliments and insults become inverses of each other, whether you're viewing them negatively or positively. But to some people, compliments are insults, while to other people, insults are compliments. And it's just kind of like what two things as opposing to each other are. They have this equality relationship that you would want to consider. And so like consider the capacity of an idea like equality to account for inversive relationships, and that things are inversive. But The reason that I'm talking about identity is because it is so inversive a topic, really. It's like why I can't exactly describe what the deal is or why it's something I want to describe. Is because it's so inversive, but it's so on the borderline between subjective and objective to the point that it's almost like the description for the borderline between them. Like it's a sameness, but the opposite of it is difference, but in what regard exactly? But it's inversive because it's inversive because you, at the point that you have an identity, it is something that makes you the same as other people. Like at the point that you are a lacrosse player, you are the same as all the other lacrosse players, or more specifically, if you're on the Texas Tech Red Raider lacrosse team, if they have one, then you are the same as all other members of your team by name, by definition. There's a sameness. You're the same as everybody else with that. But right at the point you have an identity, it also differentiates you. It also makes you different from everybody else. And so having an identity is always the same and different at the same time. And so it's a really inversive idea because it goes across the borderline. It changes between subjective and objective, but like their topics come up in the political imagination of America that become inversive, like racism, where it's a blurred line between physical and imagined, like how much physical racism is happening and how much are we just conceiving is happening. And like the left would say that it's entirely physical. There's nothing but practical examples of racism. That's how the left views it, because the left does things in more physical, practical terms visibly, because the left is waiting on what they can see happens in order to determine what reality is. And so someone on the left is more concerned with what the outcome or result is of what you do or what you produce naturally as a person or as a species. And so they're more concerned with physical terms. And so the right is like, oh, like racism is a problem, but it has to do with your paranoia and your imagination towards it. Like the right deals more in imagination, in my opinion. And it's not like that hasn't always been the case, because the left is stereotypically supposed to be more progressive and imaginative, but that's not true now because they are a really litigious religion. They're a really strict religion, really, so they're not really open-minded. But like I'm saying that it's the right that is going to come up with conspiracies and be paranoid about things. They deal more with an imaginative space. And so they're going to consider the subjectivity of racism. The left is going to consider the objectivity of racism, but it's all over America, and it's basically dancing across the borderline between the two groups, both in conservative, when it becomes a big enough political topic. The same with fake news, and then it just becomes relative to everybody, but it becomes inversive. But it's like, so fake news is an inversive idea also, but at this point no point in even talking about it, because it's not popular to right now. And so so there's something to be said about the popularity of a term. Like the height of the use of the term fake news is maybe when that's the point at which it crosses the border easily between left and right, or between real and imagined, or like fake news or something like that. And so inversion as an idea is very important for that fact, because if we understood the inversive properties of time and space, then we would recognize their character more accurately, like because they're at the point that you understand the interchangeability of time and space more and more and more is the point at which more frequently you can jump between space and time to space, across the border between the two, because they exist as a duality with like a singular main division between them. And like at the point that you're recognizing their inversive capabilities, you're jumping across the two of them more and more frequently, and in doing so connecting the two ideas, because it's like inversion is a helpful tool for you to understand the duality of things, or that things exist in dualities rather than that they always exist definitionally in ones. Like things exist in twos, and inversion is one of the tools that allows you to see that, but it's a tool like duality. It's just a divisive form of the multiplicative duality, but division, multiplication itself is very inversive. It's just that, like, inversion, do you realize inversion is all of these things, is all of these pair of opposing things? And inversion is what you use to describe it, because one is the inverse of the other, and that other thing is also the inverse of the original, but at the same time. And that's what's interesting about it. But it's to the point that, so listen to this description of it, because this word just gets silly. This word just gets silly, yo. This is where it takes off. Rocket ship to the moon. This is where it becomes believe it, here it comes, and this is where it becomes wild. Okay. This is where things get indeterminable. Things get stupid right here. You know that? Things get real stupid and unintelligible at this point where I describe it this way. Inversion described this way. Here it comes. You can use inversion, the word itself, just as an equation when you understand what a version is. And the term inversion, the in part of it obviously is in, as literally translated, but the version describes a turning, essentially, because it comes from a verb meaning to turn is verse. To turn, but a version is like a turning of some kind, but a specific turning depending on what version that you're talking about. So you could be talking about software like the Internet Explorer version 7.2, and that's a new version than the 6.1, and every new version is a new turning of the original. It's a turning into something else. It turns into something else. So it's like a conversion into something else. But it's an in-turning, which describes how inversion is like inside outness. Inversion is basically the inside out of the inverse of something is the inside out of that thing, or is the inside out of that version. And we haven't really pinned down what inversion is, because we use it just to describe upside down, like we do with when a plane is flying inverted. It's basically just flying upside down, but like inversion actually describes the reverse order of something, so that the inversion of the order of elements on the visible spectrum left to right is those same elements but right to left, which is how you convert like wavelength into frequency. That's like your terminology for the inverse is happening. The two reverse orders are happening at the same time. So it'd be the same thing to describe like the inverse of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 is like infinity minus 1, infinity minus 2 is like the reverse of the same order, is like the inverse. But we use it just to describe how something is upside down, because if a plane was flying inverted, I feel like more accurately it would actually be the tail would be flying backwards, like the tail is the guiding, like the tail would be flying in the opposite direction of, or something. It would be a bit more complicated than it's just now upside down going in the same direction it was before, because it has to be a different direction. So it's like we use it to describe upside down, but I think it's really more of an inside out. It's just that it's hard to come up with a practical example for an inside out if you don't know what you're looking for. But in reality, they're kind of everywhere, as I'm describing. But it's like, it's kind of more of an inside out. But so you have to look at a version. And so inversion is like an equation where you have in, and then you substitute version with whatever is a version of something. But everything is a turning or a different version of things. When you, like every object, a plate versus a bowl versus a water pitcher. And yeah, I do always just describe things around me when I try to come up with random objects, but that's because I only know, like, I don't know, maybe I'm just not patient enough to be like, no, go outside of this apartment to think about objects in the world as your examples. But all of those are different versions, anything you consider. And so like finiteness is a version of events. It's an argument. It's a reality. It's a reality where things play out. It's a description. It's a language, finiteness. Like, so that's a version of things. But substitute that into the equation inversion. And so then you have in. So substitute finiteness with version because it is one. So you can do that. And so then you have infiniteness, and you realize that when you substitute the version of finiteness in there, you arrive at infiniteness, or you arrive at the inversion of finiteness. And then do the same thing with infiniteness, where you have in, substitute version with infiniteness, because infiniteness is also a version of events. And you have in infiniteness, which the two ins cancel out, and you arrive at finiteness. And that's how inversion works. Interestingly enough, you can substitute version with anything, but it's like, or at least things that are opposite of each other. So what if I did that for, and so you have these words like decisive, and then automatically you know that indecisive is the inverse of decisive. You have adequate, and that you have inadequate, and then the inversion of inadequate is inadequate, and so you arrive at adequate. But it's like a complement, incomplement. It's not like you incomplement, as long as you are recognizing the in of something is like the opposite. It's just, it works as far as your use of in to describe the opposite of something. So it's like, I don't know that you're able to use in as a prefix that way in every single instance, that you're like an in complement is an insult, because it basically, you're, as long as you understand the idea of a not complement as an insult, an in insult, like linguistically you could follow the same thing and just be like an in insult, then the inverse is a salt. So that's not exactly, it doesn't work like linguistically. You have to understand the idea behind it in some cases, but yeah, like for finiteness, you just recognize that property of the word. But that's how, like, inversion is interesting since it's describing both of those at once. So like, what else does that work for? So identity, I told you that's an inversive word because it dances across the borderline between you and other people, between subjective and objective. At the point that you're describing the idea, I wanted to say that pi is also inversive because pi is relative to the equation for a circumference of a circle, the border that divides the thing that you're talking about, the circumference, and then the area of the circle is also uses pi in its formula, or like the way you describe the area. So it's kind of like that's a subjective versus an objective thing, because the objective begins basically at the point that you're describing the border of the circle, the border of the area. But it's like America has a certain border around it, and at the border of America, when you're going out towards the rest of the world, that's where objectivity begins. But objectivity and subjectivity begin at the same place. It's at the border. It just depends on what direction you're going. You're going towards America, that's towards subjectivity. You're going away from America, that's towards objectivity. And it's like that's a spectrum. But the border is the middle of a spectrum. The border between you, an entity, and the outside world of that entity is like the middle of a spectrum. But it's more abstract to understand how you go to the extreme end of a spectrum. Is that like going to the very center of America? Not exactly. There's properties, there's mathematical proofs, or at least one important one that says something like that you can reorient an area into a circle. Can reorient an area into a circle, but don't quote me on that. I got to look that up to hammer that out, that's true. Like, you could reorient the borders of an enclosure, like America is enclosed, into a circle, technically speaking, as a transformation of it, because it's like an arbitrary area. And so there's conceivably a way to make equivalent, like, deviation to make the border of America into some kind of circle, or like an infinity, because it's a version of infinity, the enclosure itself, where it's an area. But it's like the area versus the circumference, they're both relative to pi, and pi therefore is kind of both subjective objective. It's an inversive idea. And just wanted to explain that also real quick. But so you have so you have the Earth, and so I'm going to talk about what is a 1 over the Earth, because you do that, like, fractionally speaking, or if you wanted to write it that way in mathematical terms, if you have the Earth, because you could number any object the same way, that, because every single different number is just a different name. Like, the most basic significance of making a new number is that it is a new name. Like, at its lowest level, that's what its new relative value is, that it's a new name. And so the same way that every object around you is created is with a specific function that's exemplary of its name. Every object is created to have a different name. You can kind of number any object, and so it's like conceivably you could substitute the earth to be a number and then think of like, but if you could do that, then what would it mean if the earth was, you think of the inverse of the earth, what is 1 over the earth? And I'd say that 1 over the earth is like you have to consider, it's the consideration of all the space in the universe that isn't the earth. So it's like the universe, but with the earth not there. But more specifically, just the inverse of the earth is the earth is like blacked out. And so it's kind of like if the earth was a black hole and the rest of the universe was what it was. And I don't know enough about black holes to say something really interesting about black holes, but it's kind of like if the earth was blotted out and you considered the rest of the universe space as opposed to the earth. But if you're not considering that, but then you can consider the inverse of the rest of the universe besides the earth, and the inverse of that is just the earth, but that's like the earth as a position. The earth as a black hole is the earth as a negation, but that's the consideration of the entire rest of the universe. But that's like considering the entire rest of the universe as an integrated object, is the earth as blotted out as a black hole. You considering the earth in the context of the rest of the universe, the earth as a position, the earth is there. You consider it that way, that's like the earth is an integral or integrated object, and the rest of the universe is a derivative, or is like derivation, or is blacked out, because the earth as a black hole, you consider the rest of the universe as an integration, and the earth as a black hole, that's like the earth is a derivative, because derivatives are like the way that I would describe that like blacked out space is a derivative is like a river. Derivative comes from the term river, and it's a de-rivering is a derivative, because it describes any time in the event of like you have to change the course of a river like manually to channel it through a different river. Is you like if you change the linearity of a river, you create a new river, and that is a de-rivering of the original river. But that's like the original use of the term derive. That's how you first get a derive, apparently, because any new de-rivering is a derivative. So any new de-rivering is like a derivative, but a derivative is or a river is a continuum as opposed to a stationary, and an integral is meant to be stationary, but that's the dynamic between land and rivers. Rivers are they carve out space, they disintegrate space, but a derivative in calculus terms, like that's where you understand a derivative is a disintegrator as opposed to an integrator. But like ultimately, it's hard to get to the point where you're understanding the dynamic disintegration versus integration when you consider these ideas in calculus, because you describe them as integrals and derivatives, and it's disconnected from disintegration versus integration, but it's basically like the relationship between land and the border around the land. But as that naturally plays out, you can consider a river to be a natural border for a piece of land. You wouldn't have to. It's just that a river is disintegrating land. A land is stationary and stays as it is meant to represent an integrated object in this case. But calculus is basically describing the relationship between areas and the border of that area. But like the border of an area is the derivative, and then the area that when you try to describe the area under a function, that's an integration. And but like the function itself is a point on the function is a point on the line or the linearity. It was like so I'm trying to make the analogy that it's the same as a river versus land is disintegrator versus integrator. And like I say that to explain why was I saying that? Because a derivative, well, first of all, calculus is I was trying to describe that like the Earth being not there is like it being disintegrated, because that's your empty space, is like disintegrated space, in lieu of that the rest of the universe, when you consider the inverse of the Earth, the rest of the universe is integrated. But the universe being integrated is like you considering it as a fabric, the same way that Einstein described it. So like Einstein describing space as a fabric, obviously outer space is not a fabric actually, because it's just space, but him describing it as a fabric is him alluding to this inverse relationship of the Earth to the rest of the universe that exists equally to the rest of the universe looking at the Earth, but it's like a subjective objective between the Earth and the rest of the universe. But him describing the universe as a fabric is like the inverse of the Earth. It would be like, that's where you're considering the Earth to just be a ball that's like sucking in gravity, rather. I mean, yeah, I'm just saying like fabric describes the rest of the universe as integrated, and so isn't that interesting? And so if you consider the one over the Earth, that's like the rest of the universe. But what I want you to think about is, so it's like the Earth just by itself, that's positive, that's positional, but the inverse of the Earth, that's negational, but it describes either the Earth or the lack or the space that the Earth takes up is like the negation of the Earth. But that's kind of describing it as a black hole in light of the fabric of the integrated rest of the universe. But if you think about the idea of Earth over Earth, the same way I was telling you to think about 5 over 5, but that's like a multiplication of 5 with 1/5, or a multiplication of two inverses results in this 5 over 5 relationship. The multiplication of the Earth, then the 1 over Earth relationship results in Earth over Earth, if you're willing to go so far as to conceive that idea. And it basically describes the rest of the universe as integrated and the Earth as integrated. But so then it's hard to think of what's the significance of that, or how that's different from just that the Earth is already in the universe. And pretty much the significance of it is just the division between the Earth and the rest of the universe, because the only thing significant about Earth over Earth is its differentiation from Mars over Mars, or Sun over Sun, or any other celestial body within the universe that you could conceive. Because if you're considering Earth over Earth, you're considering both the Earth and the rest of the universe. You're not considering that the universe is blacked out or that the Earth is blacked out. You're considering that both of them are there. But when it's Earth over Earth, you're considering the particular delineation of the borders of the Earth versus the particular delineation, if it was Mars over Mars, would be the borders around Mars. But like only the delineation is what becomes significant, because the within of the Earth is significant in the event that you're just describing Earth over 1. If you follow what I'm saying. But it's like the borders for it are what becomes significant. And so there's something to be said about pointing out the particulars of the border from the Earth to the rest of the universe, and like the way of describing that has something to do with inversion, because when you focus on the border that exists between the Earth and the rest of the universe, or the border between subjectivity and objectivity, because the same is true for you versus your environment. It's like there's a border between you and outside of yourself, where at the point that you get outside of yourself, you can't think with your mind anymore. If you can view yourself as an object, that's an entirely different ball game, where you are not being subjective anymore. So there's like this border that exists between you and your environment. And that's like, if you want to take the individual to be the entire Earth, it's the way to focus on just the border, and the border particular to the Earth versus other planets. Then you think of it in terms of inversion, or in terms of like this Earth over Earth, as opposed to just the Earth, because just the Earth is like the way that we think of it now, I would say, is a more limited version of it. It's just thinking of the Earth positionally as an object within the universe, but like the rest of the universe. But it's the same thing in set theory. If you have a set A and a set B, like Venn diagrams. So if you have set A, and that is if set A is everybody who has Progressive auto insurance, and set B is everybody who has Geico auto insurance, then the complement of Progressive of set A is, so both of those sets exist within the universe, and the universe is the box that holds the Venn diagram, that holds the two sets. And so your set A is people who have progressive insurance. You say that the complement of the set A is everybody in the entire rest of the universe, including, so people who have everybody in the universe that isn't set A is the complement of A. So that would include even insurances that I didn't mention that have a set. That would include any other conceivable insurance, like Allstate or State Farm or anything like that, would be outside of the set A. And so that's the entire rest of the universe. That's the inverse of the set A. And then like set B is Geico. You can also do the same thing with that, but that's like two different celestial bodies have specific complements that you use different language to describe it. So it's like the complement of Geico is everybody who doesn't have Geico specifically, but it's like the complement of the Earth is everybody who is not on the Earth. And like, characteristically speaking, everybody on the Earth is defined by the Earth to the point that we're so inundated with the Earth's qualities. We're always on here. Somewhat we're infatuated within its environment. We're intoxicated within it because its specific chemical composition is intoxicating us, like specifically what the Earth produces, and we're all under it completely. We're under the reality that plays out within the Earth. It's gravity. Its gravity produces a reality that plays out very specific to the Earth. Specific identifiable elements like chemical composition, relationship to the sun that provides our specific climate, things like that. Like the characteristics of the Earth define the Earth. We are defined as much by that because none of us are great enough a thing that we have our own gravitational field. We're able to separate from the Earth. We're so totally defined by the Earth's reality. But the Earth is just a characteristic, the same way that every human is kind of represented. Every human has a different pattern. Every human as a derivative of humanity as a whole has a different pattern. They have a different pattern and are like kind of ultimately descriptive of one specific characteristic. If you wanna believe that people are different from other people, like different people represent one characteristic most definitively, but like the reason that we give everybody a different name is kind of alludes to this idea anyway, that everybody represents a different characteristic. But so it's like different derivatives of humanity as different humans walk around presenting different characteristics. Like you're representative of a characteristic, but planets in the universe are also representative of a characteristic in the same way. So it's like humans within humanity is a microcosm of planets within the universe, but words in your imagination is a microcosm of people within humanity, which is a microcosm of planets within the universe. Like words in your imagination, every one of those, that's where you can most easily recognize that every point of reference represents a characteristic, because every word is exactly that. It's a specific characteristic, or it's like you're describing a guitar, which is an object that has its own idea, kind of descriptive of its own ideology and set of characteristics that's definitively one characteristic in a guitar. And so all of the words that you have are kind of like planets in the universe, because they're all different characteristics. Like the Earth presents its own set of characteristics, but most specifically it's a juxtaposition of only all of the characteristics that combine to make the complex that is definitive as the Earth, is definable as the Earth. And so the Earth is a characteristic. You're going to describe the inverse of the Earth. That is the characteristic of it's the characteristic of not Earth. And so it's possible for you to be un-American. There's a specific way to not be America. America has its specific not that, and it's a not that is specific to it. Like indecisive is a particular not decisive, even though it's describing nothing in a way. Like if you're not decisive, then what are you? It doesn't necessarily say anything about you. It just means that you're not one thing. And so it's like the inverse of something is as particular as the original thing itself, so that the point that the Earth exists at in the universe, the rest of the universe in looking at the Earth is just as descriptive a characteristic as the Earth by itself. And And so if you're going to describe, so there's other planets out there, that are very un-Earth-like. And so they kind of have the characteristic not like Earth, or they get closer to not the extreme where they're not like Earth. So you might run into a planet that has a culture that is like characteristic of the opposite of Earth's cultures, the same way that people in the world are characteristic of like the opposite of what you want to represent, the opposite of you. Like there are people out there that are polar opposites of you. And like I would say cultures and planets work the same way, but because there's inverse characteristics that describe the polar opposite end of the extreme of what the position of that characteristic is. And like so it's interesting if you. So let me just talk myself down. I'm gonna edit this out. I only have a finite number of episodes left. I have something like 20 episodes left, but I'll try to update you on the countdown more frequently. I'll try to remember that more. But this and then this and then this and then this and then the inverse. But the inverse characteristic. Inverse is important because inverse is like the border. It kind of emphasizes the border. So I'm saying that the border that separates the Earth from the inverse of the Earth, or the Earth from the rest of the universe, like the border is a particular word or idea, is just as much as the Earth is. But the same way that when you have a position in conservatism, it is just as much automatically an inverse opposite position in liberalism if you have two halves that complete a duality. I'm a computer. So, I can't, I'm excited to do a more lighthearted episode next. That was densely informational and I feel exhausted, but, thanks for listening to that, and, bye, see you later.